Hello, my name is Nicholas Petruccelli, and this is my final presentation in summary of my final paper for the Introduction to Human Sexuality class at Colorado Christian University. The topic that I'm going to be talking about is about college student substance use and how it correlates with high-risk sexual behavior. Originally chose this topic because as an addictions therapist, oftentimes my clients will come in and they will report having secondary or tertiary addictions to things like sex and love, pornography, things that are typically associated with high-risk sexual behavior. So I thought that this research and article review would help me with a deeper understanding and knowledge in helping my clients get better treatment for substance use and other addictions. I originally hypothesized that I would find a positive correlation between substance use and high-risk sexual behavior in college students. Of course, there are other correlates, I think, that go along with risky sexual behavior in college students. At the time that I chose my topic, I couldn't define those better. But once I found a journal article out of the Journal of Sex called Personality, Sexuality, Substance Use as Predictors of Sexual Risk-Taking in College Students, I was better able to define that there are personality traits that can also be predictors of risky sexual behavior. The overarching problem is not really about high-risk sexual behavior, but really the consequences that come as a result of those. Some of the themes throughout my own personal work in my profession, but also in the article, really dealt with things like infectious diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, and unplanned pregnancies. And not just being able to identify predictors of those, but be able to put in place interventions and preventions to help kind of curb this overall problem of high-risk sexual behavior. I kind of broke down the topic into 4 different sections: the biological, psychological, sociological, and spiritual aspects to the issue itself. And use the journal article and the other material within class to kind of help bridge the gap between all of those, and also take a look at things from a Christian perspective. The biological side of the issue is really deals with the consequences, infectious diseases, unplanned pregnancies, and there's actually a lot of researchers that would say that the most important aspect of studying risky sexual behavior is really advancing the skill-based interventions to reduce infectious disease and unplanned pregnancies. From a Christian perspective, we know that God made man and woman for sex and marriage, and that when we apply biblical principles, that the idea is that perceivably that some of the biological consequences are reduced, and hopefully reduced by enough that it makes an impact. So things like waiting for sex until marriage, choosing only one partner, all those things help kind of reduce the potential of infectious diseases and unplanned pregnancies. From a psychological standpoint, many of the assessments and questionnaires that were utilized in the review, in the literature review that I did, focused more on the psychological aspects of things, especially in relation to the personality traits, which is processed a lot more cognitively. That perhaps that there are psychological functions apart from substance use that play a key role in predicting high-risk sexual behavior. So the identification of these traits are significant and important as they begin to kind of map out an individual's potential problem areas and provide some valuable insight into choosing interventions and preventions that might actually work. From a Christian perspective, that we believe that personality can actually be modified these are maybe more of an issue of the heart, where we have to get down to heart issues. And this is something that's reflected in Proverbs, where it said that as in water, face reflects face, so that a heart of a man reflects the man. From a sociological standpoint, correlates to high-risk sexual behavior could start as early as childhood. We know that social influences play a key role in people's sexuality. Again, the journal article that I did the review on focused on things like sensation-seeking and how early sensation-seeking started. And we know that social groups of children get together. Carol, in her book, talks about how kids sex play together, they masturbate together, and so that sensation seeking can actually start in childhood. The removal of those social influences, or the modification of those social influences, could actually impact the individual's ability to not participate in that risky behavior. The next thing that we have is the spiritual side of things, and we know that there's many spiritual and religious practices that are very specific in their ideologies behind sexuality and sexual behavior. We know that God's perspective from Christianity is that we focus on heterosexual sex only in Hebrews 13, remaining sexually abstinent until marriage in 1 Thessalonians 4, and the consequences for not following God's commands is, of course, spiritual death, and he talks about that in Romans 6. Christians believe the power of faithfully confessing sin to God and to other people, being accountable, not carrying that guilt and shame that go along with it. That's talked about in 1 John, it's talked about in James 5. The ideology is really rooted in not having to carry our past along with us, being able to be accountable and get it off our shoulders. It creates a barrier between the individual and God, and we know that God is a big part in intervention and prevention, especially his teaching. Overall, I really identified with this topic as I had a lot of the personality traits that correlate with sexual risk-taking, especially in regards to addiction. I'm a recovering addict. Each of these characteristics contributed to some amount of high-risk sex-taking. However, the most important and damaging risk to all that was not so much in the amount of partners that I had, but the fact that I was able to go against my own Christian values and beliefs to participate in those things. So what? So what does all this mean? Where do we go from here? Even though sexual risk-taking among college students does seem to be somewhat predictable, not conclusive, but predictable, based on certain personality types, sexuality types, and certainly with substance use. That might lead us to focus specifically on college students. What interventions, preventions do we do for college students? But the issue itself is much broader than that. That more research needs to be done, not just in college-age students, but in children and adolescents, in early adulthood, all the way up to older adults. That preventions and interventions need to be done at every level of those, because humans are just susceptible to risky sexual practices. So I think that we can use these predictability tools to create stronger interventions and stronger prevention tools to alleviate the problem, and of course from a Christian perspective, bring these into church communities, bring these into Christian circles, make them appropriate for both Christians and for the secular world, because we deal with both. Thank you for taking the time to view my presentation.